Welcome to my How Healthy Are You weekly educational podcast. My name is Dr. Thomas Brewer. I'm a PhD chemist and nutritional blood microscopist. Today is January 2nd, 2023, and this is podcast number 134. Today's topic is something known as CARB Syndrome. Now, CARB in this case doesn't mean carbohydrates. It means carbohydrate-associated brain syndrome. So this is a link between obesity and depression or other mental health issues. So if we go back and look at some history, the average man in the 1960s weighed about 166 pounds. Now the average man weighs 198 pounds. The average woman back in the 1960s weighed 140 pounds. Now the average woman weighs 170 pounds. So as you can tell, our weights are increasing, and so is our percentage body fat. Now, some say the cause for this is typical modern life, meaning we sit too much. We've been socially isolated for the past few years. Of course, environmental contaminants play a large role in inflammation and also how the body responds to these forever chemicals and the endocrine disruptors, thus making us store more fat hormonally. So food is a problem in general, but it all essentially leads to this carbohydrate-associated brain disorder. So one thing we can do to lose fat is just to burn it, and that's why we have the slow carbohydrate diet. It works great to burn fat. The whole point behind that diet is to consume low glycemic index carbohydrates. That would just be vegetables. And so that's a great way to burn fat, and I'll mention it at the very end because that's one way out of this CARB syndrome. Now, what's going on now is we consume a lot of highly processed food. These foods are essentially designed by food scientists like myself. They're PhD chemists, and they design the food to taste good, and that involves excess salt and excess sugars and excess fats so that we get these brain reward receptors functioning and firing when we eat. So that's what affects our brain are these high glycemic carbohydrates. And the result is there's less dopamine and serotonin in our body. So our body ends up losing dopamine and serotonin. These are important neurotransmitters, and that's really what this whole CARB syndrome is about, is it affects our neurotransmitters. So the final result is mental disorders and fat storage. So we have both. And so overweight, obesity, along with mental disorders. And the whole concept behind this is that there's a link between the two, mental disorders and obesity. Now, the opposite is also true. If one improves their body composition through some combination of diet and exercise, well, then they also improve their physiological conditions, meaning their brain starts working better and they start thinking better. Now, this CARB syndrome generally has carbohydrate cravings, especially at night, and maybe some of you can attest to that fact. Now, there's also other issues with CARB syndrome. Usually it involves fatigue, though fatigue is not that specific because no matter what's wrong with your body, you will be fatigued. People with CARB syndrome typically have poor impulse control, meaning they just can't control their cravings like other people can. They typically have some form of depression or insomnia or overall pain in their bodies. And this CARB syndrome leads to something called disordered eating. So it just feeds on itself. And normally a person can control their carbohydrate cravings. But when people have this CARB syndrome, they really can't, and it's a feedback loop. It just feeds on itself. The more overweight they get, the more carbohydrates they're craving. So the bottom line on this is eating poorly can affect brain development, and it can trigger more disordered eating. So again, it's a feedback loop. When you start eating poorly, this effect on your brain development is quite severe, and it's well documented. So one of the major causes of the CARB syndrome is high fructose corn syrup, which is in most of our processed foods, especially what people would call junk food, but really any food in a package, including what people think are healthy protein bars and meal replacements. If you look, there's some form of high fructose corn syrup in the package, as well as additives and preservatives and artificial sweeteners and fats that are grain-based fats that are high in linoleic acid, which is an omega-6. So all sorts of problems with these processed foods, but especially the high fructose corn syrup has a very high glycemic index, higher than glucose itself. And that's what we need to minimize in our diet. Now, there's also a link to, I'll use this term, cerveza sickness. For those of you that have been with me a while know what I'm referring to. So there's a link between cerveza sickness and obesity, and this is also well documented, and those with weaker immune systems tend to have even more problems with the cerveza sickness. We could call it long cerveza. So another issue, another point that if you're in this category of CARB syndrome, carbohydrate-associated brain syndrome, that you fix it. Okay, so how does one do that? Well, one thing we need to do is completely digest proteins efficiently. You may need to take a plant enzyme with your meals or supplement with amino acids. So when you take enzymes, you'll metabolize the proteins. They'll break down to amino acids. There is a strong link between amino acid uptake and minimizing CARB syndrome. Another thing to do is to replace more and more grains on your plate with vegetables. So a simple switch. And if you're overweight, I strongly encourage you to utilize a slow carbohydrate diet. There is 1 or 2 podcasts on this, and those are on my YouTube channel. So that concludes this week's podcast. Thank you for listening. Leave a comment, and please don't keep me a secret.